Welcome to a new podcast about one of the most remarkable and significant figures of the 20th century. I'm Professor Richard Toye.
And I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, representing the better half of the special relationship. And we are here to discuss an enormous historical character who fascinates not just us, but both sides of the Atlantic and indeed the rest of the world.
Welcome to Churchill, the finest half hour. And we're diving straight into the most momentous years in Winston Spencer Churchill's extraordinary life.
It's September 1939. The battle begins, and Winston is back.
So, September 1939, outbreak of World War II, with the invasion of Poland by Hitler's Germany on 1st of September 1939. Now, at that point, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, veteran politician, is reappointed. It's the second time in his career that he's become First Lord of the Admiralty, which is the minister responsible for the Navy. But, who was this guy, Warren? How did he get to be in this position? Why was it a kind of a matter of note that he should be returning to the Admiralty at this particular time?
I'm quite worried, Richard, that as someone who's authored multiple books on Winston Churchill, you don't know the answer to this question.
Give me a refresher.
So let's start early on. He began his political life in 1900 with the Conservative Party. He crossed over to the Liberal Party in 1904. Of course, he had served as a soldier in many far-flung places across the empire as a younger man. But eventually, prior to the First World War, he was appointed to the First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. And so he had a pre-existing relationship with the Navy. And of course, he fought in the trenches of First World War and then came back, held various ministerial jobs. And then in 1922, he was in power with Lloyd George. And of course, after the Chinac crisis, that government collapsed and he found himself without an office again.
Let me stop you there for a minute, Warren, because you're going through things pretty quickly. Let's go back to his period as First Lord of the Admiralty the first time, because this was really something which actually didn't turn out well for him.
No, so he set out with the idea at the First Lord of the Admiralty to really try to modernize the British Navy and introduce fuel, which of course got him kind of into Middle Eastern politics. And in those days...
Oil fuel. The ships did have fuel prior to that.
That's true. Oil, I should say. And of course, that embroiled him in Middle Eastern politics, which of course in those days meant that he was embroiled with the Ottoman Empire. And basically, and there's lots of stuff around this, but Churchill had promised some ships to the Ottoman Empire and then reneged on those ships just prior to the First World War. The war broke out. Some historians, this is highly debated, think that this is one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire formally went with the Central Powers instead of the Allied powers in the First World War, although there's a lot of evidence that indicates that's not the reason why. Consequently, he tried to force the Straits and sent down
the Dardanelles Straits.
Yes, the Dardanelles Straits. And he tried to force those straits. He sent down a flotilla. It was unsuccessful, and as a result, they had to set up a kind of landing operation on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and this led, of course, to the...
Let me intervene and say, it's the British who are supposed to be understated. You're saying it was unsuccessful. This kind of, is known as kind of a sort of world historical mess up, really, isn't it?
It was catastrophic. It wasn't just a failed thing. I mean, so forcing the Straits was unsuccessful. That resulted in the Gallipoli landings, which resulted in the Battle of Gallipoli, which was catastrophic for not just Great Britain, but for Australia, for the Allied powers in general. And as a result, Churchill had to resign his position. And this is the reason that he went out and actually fought in the trenches in the First World War to sort of almost make amends, I think.
Right. So what we're basically saying is he was a pretty controversial guy.
I think everyone viewed him with suspicion, in part because after the war, he rejoined the Conservative Party. So you were never quite sure whose side he was on.
Okay, so taking us through to the interwar period, you've mentioned that he is a government minister, but falls from power in 1922, loses his seat at that point, bounces back, rejoins the Conservative Party, becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer or Finance Minister in 1924, does that for 5 years. What happens after that?
Well, by this point, we got to remember he was born in 1874. And so Churchill kind of presents himself as this grand old man of empire. And as we enter into the 30s, there's a lot of debates about India leaving the empire, which he is vehemently opposed to. And he finds himself increasingly out of touch with mainstream conservative politics. And so he enters what most Churchill biographers, historians refer to as a political wilderness.
Right. So you've, of course, mentioned India, but also he was obviously becoming aware of the threat posed by Nazi Germany, Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany in 1933.
Yes, that's right. And from the very beginning, Churchill opposed the militarism and the brand of authoritarianism that Hitler represented. And this differed a lot with a lot of other Tory politicians at the time because they saw Germany as the kind of answer, the Hitler's Germany as a kind of answer to the rise of Bolshevism in the East and in Russia in particular, and saw it as a check on that. And Churchill never really bought into that concept. He saw Hitler and Hitlerism, as he described it, Nazism, whatever you want to call it, as a real threat to not just Britain, but to the order in Europe and probably to the world order.
Right. So, I mean, he was right, wasn't he? So why didn't everybody just go, well, that seems to be correct. We'll just follow what you're suggesting.
Well, so he was politically out of anyone really listening to him. He is the lone voice in the wilderness saying this Hitler guy is bad news, but he's kind of the only one.
I suppose I would maybe say he's not actually the only one, but that the people who there are lots of people who sort of dislike Hitler, but there were kind of contrasting views about what you should do about this. And I suppose I might say, you mentioned India, that actually that was one of the major themes which Churchill was following or campaigning on during the first part of the 30s.
Yeah.
And that was so therefore he wasn't sort of purely single-mindedly campaigning on Nazi Germany. There was a kind of at least a sort of a twin track.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
No, I didn't mean to imply it was just about Germany, but yeah, obviously India is huge. In fact, I would have argued in the early 30s, India was probably more important to Churchill and maintaining India inside the British Empire. His hatred for Hitler was only matched by his hatred for Gandhi.
I guess, the other thing which we've kind of alluded to already is that he was also somebody who was perceived as, by quite a number of people, as having failed in his political career. You mentioned the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. There were other controversial episodes, such as the 1926 general strike. There was his attitude over India, for example, was going to make it difficult for left-wing people to feel comfortable sort of allying themselves with him over Germany, where they both he and a number of other conservative dissenters and liberals and Labour politicians, all disliked the Nazis, but the question of what strategy you did in terms of following rearmament or saying, well, you don't need to rearm if all countries work together collectively through the League of Nations. These are things which are kind of obstacles to collaboration across the aisle, if you want to use that term.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And also, I think you raised a really interesting point about Churchill being kind of a failed politician. One of my favorite books is Robert Rhodes James's Churchill, a Study in Failure, a biography of him up to 1939, and is a remarkably interesting way to kind of view a man who would later be known as one of the most successful and brilliant men for the later part of his life. Churchill, I think, comes to represent in this political wilderness though there are other points, he sees himself, certainly the way he kinda constructs it, and the way that Martin Gilbert, his official biographer, later kinda constructed it as not necessarily the only voice, but certainly out of touch with what's going on.
And obviously, one moment that was absolutely critical here was the Munich crisis in the autumn of 1938.
Absolutely, Richard. I think that that's actually a real turning point probably for how Britain understood what was happening, how Chamberlain understood what was happening, and also certainly how Churchill, I mean, it was a real turning point for him too.
Yeah, so I mean, people will remember that this was the time when Neville Chamberlain, as Prime Minister, was flying backwards and forwards to Germany to meet with Hitler to discuss the fate of Czechoslovakia. And uh, arrived at an agreement which gave a big chunk of Czechoslovakia to Hitler's Germany, was seen in Britain at the time as a great success because war had been avoided. Yet within a few months, when Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, it was quickly seen as a failure. But at the moment when Chamberlain was flying backwards and forwards, then Churchill was sort of on the sidelines, had a few friends he was talking to, but with really very little capacity to influence events, even though a lot of people would say that he was fundamentally right when he said that, Britain had effectively sacrificed not only its honor but its security through this
Well,
deal.
and isn't there's even an argument that even at this point, Chamberlain believes that war is inevitable. I mean, there are certainly a couple biographers of Chamberlain who thinks even at this point, even once he's arrived back, that he still sees the darkening clouds.
Well, I think that what Chamberlain thought was that he was on a win-win because either Hitler would stick to the agreement, in which case, good news, you've got peace, or if Hitler breaks his word, then everybody will see that sort of Hitler has been exposed, which of course is in one sense what's happened. But what Chamberlain didn't realize is that that would discredit him as well. And Churchill in 1939, although he's still out of power, is kind of the beneficiary of this changing mood. And although Chamberlain does remain sort of powerful and popular within the Conservative Party, Churchill is on the rise in the sort of spring and summer of 1939.
He's certainly gathering his people to him as everyone's starting to see that Germany is such a threat.
Okay, so let's bring this back to September 1939. We've kind of said, all right, there was this guy who, I mean, he did have a long track record, obviously, but a kind of a mixed record. And you may even if you think that sort of Churchill was brilliant in everything that he did, it's certainly a fact that many people didn't trust him and perceived much of what he'd done as having failed. So how does he move from that position as being this isolated guy in the wilderness to somebody who, in September 1939, is brought back by Conservative Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain into the War Cabinet, into a kind of a key position, a political position, but responsible for directing the Navy and obviously a sort of crucial part of the military?
Well, I think, Churchill, one of the things he had earned a sort of view of him as a kind of a warmonger going back to the First World War. And that's one of the reasons a lot of people sort of viewed him with suspicion. And I think that Chamberlain needed to reassure people that he was serious, particularly now that Germany had started expanding the way that it had by September 1st. It's obviously very clear that Hitler meant business. And bringing Churchill back into the Navy, that was a way of Chamberlain saying, "Hey, look, I'm taking this seriously. I've got a guy here who's ready to fight, wants to fight." So he brings him back into the war cabinet.
So you mentioned in the intro, there's this famous story that
Mm.
when he returns to the Admiralty, the kind of like the first thing that happens is that a telegram is sent out to all ships with this sort of three-word telegram saying Winston is back.
Yeah, and they were all signaling supposedly.
Supposedly. Well, we'll come back to whether or not or the truth behind that story in a minute. But I suppose my question would be, do you reckon if that telegram did go out to everybody in at a British ship across the world, were people going to be going, "That's great news," or were there going to be a bunch of people who were going, you sure this is a good idea?"
Yeah, I think it was met with trepidation probably because again, even if the idea is like, look, I need to show that I'm tough on what's going on here. We're going to bring in Churchill and put him back into the Navy. Well, the last time he was in the Navy was not great, and he clearly doesn't shy away from a fight. So if I was in the Navy and I got that message, I'd be like, that's
Yeah,
starting
well,
to heat up.
there's actually some doubts about it's a very famous story. There is kind of some doubt about whether or not it really happened. I've actually spent a lot of time in the archives looking into this.
I'm shocked.
Yes. I mean, the story appears in Churchill's war memoirs, which the first volume appears, this story appears in 1948. Now, there seems to be no reason on earth to think that he would just have, like, made that up. But when you look for concrete evidence from September 1939 that this telegram was sent, I haven't been able to definitively prove that it happened. And that
Yeah.
goes to the level of going to the National Archives in London and looking for the ship's logs and, seeing if anybody recorded that this message had actually come in. Now, there are people who kind of after the war write into newspapers saying, "Oh yes, I definitely remember it. I was there. I was on one of these ships." It's just a little strange to me that you don't find anything in the news or in people's diaries at the time that this has happened. So again, as I say, I don't think Churchill would have just randomly made it up, but it's still a bit of a mystery.
No, it is. And I have to imagine that what happened is maybe someone said to him, "Oh yeah, the Navy did this thing," without any evidence. And Churchill was like, "Wow, I like that. I'm going to incorporate that into my book." I don't think that he made it up. I don't think there was any sort of like ill intent. I think it was something that he had gathered, perhaps orally, and just included it, and it made its way into his memoir because it's the story you wanted to tell.
So, of course, it remains a crucial part of the legend, like quite a lot of other stories about Churchill. Of course, we've grabbed it and we've used it as a title for this episode, which I suppose just shows its enduring power and kind of whether or not it actually happened. It does show that Churchill had a gift for a phrase and for imprinting things in the public memory. And on that note, let's go for a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how Churchill operated as First Lord and public perceptions of him at the time.
Like Winston, we are back at Churchill the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me as ever is Richard Toye. And we were just discussing Churchill's return to the Admiralty. Now, we talked a bit about the Wilderness, and Churchill had just gotten back to the Admiralty. And you mentioned, Richard, the sort of Winston is back legacy, but what would the actual view of Churchill from the public and him returning to that position?
Well, he'd certainly gained in popularity over the course of the previous years, and particularly in the aftermath of the Munich Agreement of 1938, which had ceded a large part of Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany, and then the Germans had followed up in 1939 by conquering the rest of Czechoslovakia. So what had seemed to many people like a desirable deal in the autumn of 1938 was kind of unraveling by next year, and Churchill's warnings against Munich seemed to be being proven to be correct. Now, in a sense, public opinion research was at this point rudimentary, but it had actually started. There were organizations such as Mass Observation, the Gallup Company, which did opinion polling. So we actually know a fair amount about what ordinary people thought. And again, it's worth saying that he was a controversial figure, not just for his foreign policy views or for his views on the empire, but for his domestic policy views. There were many people within his own party who distrusted him. There were people on the left who were hostile to him. But of course, as you were mentioning earlier, sort of one of the sort of persistent criticisms against him was that he was a warmonger. But of course, at the point where you've got an actual war that has started, well, you kind of want somebody to mung it. So being a warmonger is not a bad thing at this point.
He's the man for his time and place.
He's the man for his time and place. So I think he's really keen to establish himself as the voice of the war effort, if you like. That Neville Chamberlain, in some ways, a kind of underrated politician, or at least somebody who kind of people misunderstand or is portrayed as being weak, when in fact you could say his problem was really the reverse, that he was very arrogant, was completely convinced of his own correctness,
Yeah.
but certainly not somebody who was kind of a natural war leader. And so Churchill, who is clearly a great speech maker, actually not so familiar to the public in terms of broadcasting to them directly. He hasn't been on the BBC that much throughout the 1930s, for example. He certainly seems, when he does speak to the public, vigorous, warlike, determined, kind of all the adjectives that we associate with him, really. And certainly amongst public figures, when they appear on the screen in newsreels, so kind of the short films about contemporary news issues that appear at the start of cinema programs. He's popular. People are there observing, who gets applauded the most, and he's up there amongst the most popular politicians.
I think that there's a real interesting thing happening here, and I want to unpick a little bit, which is, you see Churchill and the ascendancy here becoming the kind of bulldog, Britain's kind of tough man, because as you say, the war is going on. You kind of want someone who knows about war because there's an actual war now, versus the kind of what I've always kind of thought is the tragedy of Neville Chamberlain, because Chamberlain has this reputation for being a weak man because of Munich and so forth. Which if you read any of his biographies, it couldn't be further from the truth. If anything, he wouldn't listen to people around him. And he presents to me as almost a 19th century politician, which of course makes sense because he was. He liked to do things by committee. He liked to do things by having conversations with people. He's a believer in that because he believed in the power of his own personality to be able to sway people around. This is one of the reasons whenever he met Hitler, he believed that he could convince Hitler of the right thing. And Hitler knew this about him and kind of read it into him and told him whatever he wanted to hear. And so that's kind of how Hitler was able to buy that time off of Neville Chamberlain. Of course, Neville Chamberlain, by the end of it, as we know, was also trying to buy time so that Britain could rearm itself. So there's another way to look at it in that, is that he's being quite sly there. But when Churchill enters the Admiralty, it's already in October, he's talking about Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside of an enigma, which is something we still, as a phrase, I still think about, not on a daily basis, but maybe, right? So, I mean, he's got these amazing turns of phrase. And the other thing that I think that Churchill brought to this was, as soon as he's in office, he works at a rate that is outrageously fast compared to Neville Chamberlain and the kind of gentry 19th century, we do this and then we have tea. Whereas Churchill's like, action this day, do it. And I think that alone is one of the reasons that the view of Neville Chamberlain is this sort of like guy didn't know what was going on, versus Churchill, who maybe didn't always have the best ideas, but was at least doing something, just trying to push stuff through, has emerged.
Yeah, and I mean, I think another sort of point of context to understand this, of course, is that the Germans succeed in conquering Poland very quickly. And of course, this is seen as sort of the phony war where not much is happening. But one area where quite a lot of things are happening is in the naval field. There are naval battles and skirmishes in various places around the world, which gives Churchill a position where he can kind of sort of report on the action and sort of be, if you like, at the center of the news cycle. But the other thing to mention about the fact that Poland has been conquered so quickly is that it does lead people to say, well, what are we fighting about? The casus belli was to defend Poland. That clearly hasn't worked. Why should we continue to be at war? And so this is a moment, I would actually say, really the only moment during the entirety of the conflict where there is a very large and significant movement towards a compromise peace. People like David Lloyd George, the former Liberal Prime Minister, who's still in Parliament, as sort of speaking up in favour of a compromise peace, and Lloyd George is being flooded with letters from people who were supporting him. So, and of course, this is something which Hitler would very much like, to allow him to sort of secure his gains, having humiliated France and Britain, really. And of course, Churchill is against this, and in Chamberlain's defence, absolutely, that he was against this too.
Yeah.
But one thing which Churchill is good at is when sort of Chamberlain makes a speech kind of rejecting German peace proposals, he helps really kind of toughen up the language in the speech in order to make it seem more determined and kind of more uncompromising. So I mean, I'd be interested in your view on this, but there's quite a lot of evidence that actually Chamberlain and Churchill, who were generally kind of portrayed in popular culture as being sort of polar opposites, are actually at this time, in some ways, working relatively effectively together.
Yeah, I was exactly going to say that as well. Is that actually during this period, once Churchill's there and Churchill's with Chamberlain and his war cabinet, I think that you can make a pretty good case that they're actually kind of tag teaming this situation pretty well, and you can see this play out in a few different ways, but the kind of enthusiasm he brought about the U-boat campaign, and that's one of the things that I think Chamberlain also sort of applauded him on, and I don't think Chamberlain particularly saw Churchill as a threat at that point, but other people are starting to listen to Churchill's speeches,
Right.
and his speeches are so powerful that he realizes that other people are starting to be convinced of him. I also think simultaneously look at Churchill at the Admiralty. He brought a real enthusiasm to the role that made the British Navy kind of proud of itself. Not that it hadn't been. He was out there sort of being a cheerleader for the British Navy. And I think that that's one of the things that particularly people who supported the Navy, and of course that's a huge part of the British public, really sort of glommed onto in Churchill becoming a leading figure at this time.
And of course, the other thing, and this is very kind of typical really of Churchill, is that he is sending, you mentioned his kind of work rate. Well, something which he does is to write these really kind of pretty lengthy memoranda and claiming that various things should be done or, aren't working properly or whatever. And he fires quite a lot of these off to Chamberlain, who says, "Well, I'm sure that he's doing this in order to include them in his book," by which he means his expected post-war memoirs. And of course, Churchill had published after the First World War this enormous multi-volume book called The World Crisis. So somebody said that Winston has written a book about himself and called it The World Crisis. In it, he quoted an awful lot of documents which he had written during the First World War himself in order to sort of justify his actions. So there's a little bit, I think, of skepticism on Chamberlain's behalf that what Churchill is doing is not necessarily always purely just to advance the common good, but is put on record stuff which he wants to be on record so that he can use it to justify himself later on.
Well, yeah, no, I think that that's really interesting. So Chamberlain's not the only one who's sort of suspicious of Churchill, right? So Mackenzie King, and I should say he was the Prime Minister of Canada, criticized Churchill because he thought that he was trying to monopolize the stage for the Admiralty after having announced that Canadian troops were coming to join the effort. And so I think that you can see that Churchill must have been a difficult man to work with because he must have been an enormous egotist, right? There's no way you can read his biographies or rather autobiographies, memoirs, whatever, and not know that. Having said that, he had lots of great ideas. Some were fantastic, some were terrible, but he was an idea man and he produced these ideas at a remarkable speed in a way that I think kind of lapped Chamberlain. And of course, it should also be mentioned, at this time, though, I don't think he had been diagnosed. Chamberlain was quite ill, right? I mean, his ability to do work is sort of waning off at this point. So I think Churchill's push to be active, to be excited about the Navy, ebullient, supporting the troops, that kind of stuff was really a welcome thing. And I think that also works well for Chamberlain, who's like, look, the guy I've appointed is doing this stuff, but obviously there's a jockeying for position there that certainly Chamberlain and then outside of Britain, the Allies see. But I think one of the reasons that the Allies are even thinking about Churchill is because his speeches are making it to places like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. You see this happening in Britain, but he also becomes a kind of unifying voice across the world for the Commonwealth. And that becomes a tremendous tool for him. And oh, by the way, not just the Commonwealth, but he's heard in America as well.
And I think that kind of just brings us to the point of trying to sum up where kind of Churchill and Britain got to by the period that we're talking about. We've talked about how Churchill was an adventurer, if you like, he was described as a gambler, somebody who was a very colourful figure, somebody who had had even a global reputation from the start of his career with his imperial adventures. He was somebody who had political successes, but was also associated in many people's minds with the failure at Gallipoli, with strike breaking, for example, domestically speaking as well. So that he got to a position where he kind of reestablished himself by the top point. He's reappointed as First Lord of the Admiralty. He further establishes himself through his public speeches, radio broadcasts in the autumn of 1939 and the spring of 1940. But he's not wholly trusted by any means. He may have got nearer to the prime ministership, but it's not kind of a foregone conclusion. And essentially, he's now in charge in terms of the naval aspects of a military campaign which is about to go terribly badly wrong.
That's true. He's at the head of something that's about to backfire enormously in his face.
So, 64-year-old Winston Churchill is out of the political wilderness, but military disaster is looming. Join us next time to find out how he handled it, here on Churchill, the finest half hour, available wherever you get your podcasts.
And in the meantime, KBO.